The year 1849 dawned like a scythe over the sprawling, gray silhouette of the Maddox Orphanage, its formidable stone walls rising against the sullen winter sky. Nestled on the outskirts of Boston, far enough from the city's bustling docks and burgeoning gas lamps to feel utterly isolated, it was less a sanctuary and more a gall for the innocent. Its windows, high and narrow, resembled vacant eyes staring out at a world that had forgotten the souls within. A biting wind, carrying the scent of frost and distant, unfulfilled promises, whistled through the eaves, a mournful lament that seemed to echo the silent sorrows of the 200-odd children confined within its cold embrace. Inside, the chill penetrated bone deep. The main dormitory, a cavernous chamber that smelled perpetually of stale gruel, unwashed bodies, and the faint, lingering despair of lost dreams, housed nearly 50 boys. Their beds, mere straw pallets laid out in neat, Spartan rows, offered little comfort against the biting cold that seeped through the thin walls. Each morning, before the first bruised light of dawn could even think of piercing the grime-streaked windows, the cacophony of a brass bell, wielded by the unforgiving Matron Grims, ripped through the fragile veil of sleep. It was a sound that not only signified the end of a restless night, but also the commencement of another day of unrelenting toil, meager sustenance, and the crushing weight of their collective abandonment. Amongst the tangle of slumbering forms, a small, 11-year-old girl named Elara stirred. Her sleep was rarely deep, often punctuated by the low whimpers of Thomas, her younger brother, who lay beside her, thin and restless. He was 7, with eyes too large for his pallid face, and a cough that had settled in his chest like a stubborn, unwelcome guest since the autumn rains had begun. Elara's hand instinctively sought his, her calloused fingers finding his frail ones, a silent pact of survival forged in the crucible of their shared misery. They had arrived at Maddox a year ago, orphaned by the cholera epidemic that had swept through the city like a silent predator, claiming their parents within days of each other. The memory of their small, cluttered tenement room, filled with the scent of their mother's baking bread and their father's pipe tobacco, felt like a faded daguerreotype, precious but increasingly distant. "Thomas," she whispered, nudging him gently as the bell's harsh clang vibrated through the floorboards. "Wake up. Matron Grims will be here." Thomas whimpered, burrowing deeper into the threadbare blanket, a flimsy shield against the encroaching cold. "It's too cold, Elara," he mumbled, his voice raspy. "I know, lamb," she murmured, rising cautiously, her bare feet meeting the frigid wooden floor. Her breath plumed in the air. The other boys were already stirring, a collective groan rising from the pallets. Small, wiry figures, some no older than Thomas, scrambled to their feet, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Elara moved with practiced efficiency, her movements economical, honed by months of this unforgiving routine. She smoothed down her coarse gray dress, already stiff with dirt, and ran a hand through her tangled brown hair. Her face, sharp with hunger, bore a perpetually watchful expression, her gray eyes missing nothing. She was the sentinel of their small, beleaguered unit, and Thomas was her sole charge. Matron Grims swept into the dormitory a moment later, her voluminous black skirt rustling like a gathering storm cloud. She was a woman carved from granite, her features sharp and unyielding, her eyes the color of slate, missing no infraction. A heavy iron key ring clanked at her waist, a constant reminder of her dominion. "Up, you sluggish wretches! Up!" The Lord's grace does not await the lazy." Her voice, surprisingly deep, cut through the morning air like a shard of ice. Her assistant, the perpetually nervous Sister Agatha, scurried in her wake, her face a pale contrast to the matron's severity. The boys scrambled faster, a flurry of small, bony limbs. Elara helped Thomas sit up, gently rubbing his back as he coughed, a dry, hacking sound that tore at her heart. She worried endlessly about his cough, about the consumption that had claimed so many other children in the orphanage over the years. The infirmary, a cold, isolated room at the far end of the corridor, was less a place of healing and more a final waiting room. The morning ritual began with a frigid wash in a communal trough of icy water, followed by a prayer session that felt less like spiritual communion and more like military drill. Reverend Blackwood, a gaunt, humorless man, droned on about sin and redemption, his words bouncing off the high ceilings of the drafty chapel, doing little to warm the frozen fingers or lift the drooping spirits of his young congregation. Elara, huddled next to Thomas, whose shivering was more pronounced today, often found her mind wandering. She would mentally recount the dwindling number of pence her father had sewn into the lining of her old coat before he died, a paltry sum meant for a better future, now an unattainable dream. She would imagine a world beyond these walls, a world with warm fires, soft beds, and food that didn't taste of ash and regret. Breakfast was a thin, watery gruel served in chipped tin bowls. It offered little nourishment, merely enough to quell the most immediate pangs of hunger. Thomas struggled to finish his. "It tastes like sawdust," he whispered, pushing a spoonful around. "Eat it, Thomas," Elara urged, her voice low. "You need the strength." She watched him, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. He was growing thinner by the day, his usually bright eyes dull. If he didn't eat, he'd grow weaker, and if he grew weaker... She couldn't even bear to complete that thought. She quickly finished her own portion, then subtly nudged her bowl towards him. "Here, have a little of mine." He looked up, his eyes wide. "But then you won't have enough." "I'm not as hungry today." She lied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. He hesitated for only a moment before taking a few more spoonfuls, his small act of acceptance a testament to their unbreakable bond. The day's labor began soon after. For the older boys, it was work in the orphanage's small, perpetually muddy vegetable patch, even in winter, turning over the frozen earth, or hauling firewood from the nearby coppice. For the younger ones and most of the girls, it was laundry, scrubbing the never-ending piles of coarse linen in stinging cold water or mending, their fingers pricked raw by needles. Elara, being one of the oldest girls, was often assigned to the scullery, a dank, cramped room in the orphanage's cavernous basement. The air was heavy with the smell of grease and decay, and the constant clang of pots and pans was a deafening symphony. She spent hours hunched over a trough of murky water, scrubbing mountains of dirty dishes, her hands growing chapped and numb. Today, however, Matron Grimm's had a different task for her. "Elara, you are to assist Sister Agnes in the infirmary," she announced, her voice devoid of any warmth. Elara's heart seized. The infirmary. It was a place of last resort, a place where children went to waste away. And mind you, no dawdling. Sister Agnes has far too much on her plate. A flicker of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Elara. Was it Thomas? Had his cough worsened overnight, she suppressed the urge to run, to demand answers. Matron Grimm's tolerated no questions, no displays of emotion. "Yes, Matron," Elara responded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The infirmary was as grim as she had imagined. The single large room, its windows mostly boarded up, was perpetually dim, lit only by a few sputtering oil lamps. The air hung heavy with the cloying scent of sickness, a mingling of camphor, sweat, and something else. Something indefinable, but deeply unsettling, the smell of imminent departure. 4 beds lined the walls, 3 of which were occupied. A small boy, no older than Thomas, lay pale and still in one, his breathing shallow. An older girl coughed weakly into a stained handkerchief in another. Sister Agnes, a small woman with kind, wary eyes and a perpetually worried frown, was wiping the brow of the third occupant. "Elara," she said, her voice soft, a rare commodity in this place. "Thank goodness you're here. There's a new patient arrived just this morning. From the city, they say, found wandering the streets." Elara's gaze was drawn to the 4th bed. A girl, perhaps a year or 2 younger than herself, lay huddled beneath a thin blanket, her face turned away. She was small, even for her age, and her shoulders trembled. Elara felt a pang of unexpected sympathy. New arrivals were always the hardest hit by the orphanage's brutal reality. The initial shock, the stark contrast between any semblance of a former life and the unyielding harshness of Maddox, often broke their spirits within weeks. "What is her name, sister?" Elara asked, approaching cautiously. "She hasn't spoken a word." Sister Agnes sighed, wringing out a cloth in a basin of water. "Scared, poor thing. And so cold. We need to warm her up. Can you fetch some more hot water from the kitchen, Elara? And see if cook can spare some broth. A little warmth might coax her out of her shell." Elara nodded, grateful for the task. It was better than standing idle, watching the slow march of illness. She hurried to the kitchen, a bustling, chaotic space, and managed to wheedle a small pot of lukewarm water and a bowl of thin, albeit greasy, broth from cook. A gruff woman with flour, dusted hands, but a surprisingly soft spot for the infirmary children. Back in the infirmary, Elara carefully set the broth and water down. Sister Agnes was now tending to the coughing girl, leaving Elara to approach the new arrival. She sat on the edge of the bed, her presence quiet, non-threatening. The girl stirred, her head turning slowly. Elara gasped, a small sound escaping her lips. The girl's face was bruised and streaked with dirt, but it was her eyes that caught Elara's breath, a startling shade of green, wide with terror, but also a flicker of something else, something defiant. And then, Elara noticed the peculiar, almost luminous quality of her hair, a startling shade of fiery red, the color of a dying ember, unlike anything Elara had ever seen. "Hello," Elara whispered, her voice gentle. "My name is Elara. What's yours?" The green eyes blinked, but no sound emerged. The girl merely stared, a haunted look in her gaze. "It's all right," Elara continued, trying to project a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "You're safe here, mostly. It's Maddox Orphanage. It's not so bad once you get used to it." Even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie, a flimsy veil over the bleak truth. "Are you hungry? I have some broth here." The girl's gaze drifted to the bowl of broth, and a tremor passed through her small frame. Slowly, painstakingly, she reached out a thin hand, her fingers trembling as she took the bowl. She brought it to her lips and began to sip, her movements stiff and jerky. Elara watched, a silent observer, feeling a strange connection to this lost soul, a kinship born of shared circumstance. After a few sips, the girl lowered the bowl, her eyes meeting Elara's again. This time, there was a faint spark of something akin to gratitude. "My name is Maeve." A voice, barely a whisper, floated from the girl's lips. It was thin and reedy, like a forgotten melody. "Maeve O'Connell?" Elara smiled, a genuine, if fleeting, smile. "Welcome, Maeve O'Connell." The day passed in a blur of chores and quiet vigilance. Elara spent her hours in the infirmary, fetching water, tidying the small room, and observing Maeve. Maeve remained mostly silent, but her watchful green eyes followed Elara's movements. As the day wore on, a small measure of warmth seemed to return to Maeve's limbs, and her shivering subsided. Sister Agnes, noticing the subtle shift, allowed Maeve a small bowl of solid gruel at midday, which she ate with a quiet desperation. In the late afternoon, as the shadows lengthened and the infirmary grew colder, Elara found a moment to sit beside Maeve again. "Where are you from, Maeve?" she asked softly, knowing that such questions were often painful. Maeve hesitated, her gaze distant, fixed on a patch of peeling paint on the far wall. "From across the water," she finally said, her voice still faint but a little stronger. "Ireland. My da brought me," he said. "He said America was a land of opportunity. He said we'd find work, find a new life." Her voice broke. "He got sick. On the ship. The fever. They took him." Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "I was alone. I wandered. Then they found me." Elara's heart ached. The Irish famine had driven thousands to America's shores, only to find a different kind of hardship, a different kind of death. Thomas and she, born in America, had still found themselves in the same predicament. "I'm so sorry, Maeve," Elara said, reaching out to gently touch the girl's arm. "It's hard here. But we manage. We look after each other." She thought of Thomas, of their quiet understanding. "You're not alone now." Maeve looked at her, and in her green eyes, Elara saw not just fear, but a deep, primal loneliness. Maeve was an outsider even amongst the orphans, her accent and her red hair marking her as distinct. Elara understood that feeling. Though she and Thomas shared blood, their parents genteel, if modest. Background set them apart from many of the rougher children who had known street life before the orphanage. That evening, during the communal meal, Elara sought out Thomas in the boys' dining hall. He was huddled with a group of younger boys, picking listlessly at his gruel. His cough seemed worse, a dry, persistent rattle in his chest. "How are you, lamb?" she asked, kneeling beside him, trying to keep her voice light despite the apprehension swirling within her. He looked up, his eyes glassy. "I'm cold, Elara, and my chest hurts." Elara pressed her hand against his forehead. It was warm, too warm. A jolt of fear, stark and cold, shot through her. "You have a fever, Thomas," he whimpered. "I don't want to go to the infirmary." The infirmary was a word whispered with dread, a place where children seldom returned from. "No, no, you won't." Elara lied, her mind racing. She knew what Matron Grimm's would do. A fever, a cough, into the infirmary he'd go, to lie among the dying, to be forgotten. She couldn't let that happen. She had to protect him. Later, as the children were herded back to their dormitories, Elara made a swift decision. She knew the orphanage's layout intimately. She knew about the small, disused storage closet next to the boiler room in the basement, a place rarely visited, filled with dusty, forgotten items. It was dark, it was cold, but it was out of sight. It was a risk. A terrible risk, but what choice did she have? Thomas. She whispered once they were back in the dormitory, the air thick with the muffled snores and soft whimpers of sleeping children. Listen to me carefully. We are going to go somewhere warmer. Just for tonight. We'll be safe. He looked up at her, his eyes wide in the gloom. Where? A secret place, she said, trying to infuse her voice with a sense of adventure rather than desperation. Just us. But you must be very quiet. Can you do that? He nodded, his small face etched with a mix of fear and trust. Under the cover of darkness, once Matron Grimm's had completed her final rounds, her heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor, and then fading, Elara gently roused Thomas. He was burning up. She slipped her worn shawl, her most precious possession, around his shoulders. He shivered violently. Hold my hand tightly, she instructed, her voice barely audible. They crept out of the dormitory, past the sleeping forms, their bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The corridor was a tunnel of deepest black, broken only by slivers of moonlight through the high windows. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind rattling a pane, sounded like a thunderclap. They navigated the labyrinthine corridors, past the intimidating door to Matron Grimm's office, past the silent chapel, and down the winding, stone steps to the basement. The air grew heavier, colder, permeated with the damp scent of earth and old stone. Elara clutched Thomas's hand tighter, feeling the tremor in his small fingers. Finally, they reached the boiler room, a vast, echoing space filled with the monstrous, hulking shape of the orphanage's ancient boiler, its pipes groaning and hissing in the cold. To the side, half obscured by stacked wooden crates, was the door to the storage closet. It was unlocked, as Elara had hoped, its existence so forgotten that locking it seemed unnecessary. She pushed it open, revealing a cramped, pitch, black space filled with the musty scent of dessous. Discarded furniture, broken tools, and piles of old, forgotten linens were crammed within. It was not warm, not truly, but it was sheltered from the drafts that plagued the main building. In here, Thomas, she whispered, pulling him inside. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to reverberate off the stone walls. Elara winced, praying no one had heard. She fumbled in the dark, her hands brushing against rough wood and cobwebs, until she found a pile of old, dusty blankets. They were stiff and smelled of mildew, but they offered a measure of warmth. She wrapped Thomas tightly in them, pulling him close, her own body a shield against the cold. Rest now, Thomas, she murmured, stroking his forehead. It was burning hot. Fear, cold and sharp, tightened its grip on her heart. She knew this was dangerous. If they were discovered, the punishment would be severe, perhaps even expulsion, though where would a child be expelled to? The streets. The workhouse. It didn't bear thinking about. But staying in the dormitory, or worse, being sent to the infirmary, felt like a slower, surer death. They spent the night huddled together in the dark, Thomas whimpering occasionally, his feverish breaths shallow and ragged. Elara did not sleep. Her mind raced, devising plans, rejecting them, her focus entirely on her brother's survival. She remembered her mother's old remedies, long forgotten whispers of ginger and honey, of warm poultices. Things they didn't have, couldn't get. But she had her will. She had her determination. And she had Thomas. As the first faint light of dawn seeped into the basement through a high, grimy vent, Elara heard the tale sounds of the orphanage awakening. The bell would clang soon. She had to get Thomas back to the dormitory before morning roll call. But he was too weak. He couldn't walk. Panic clawed at her throat. Suddenly, a soft rustle from outside the closet door. Elara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had they been discovered? She held her breath, clutching Thomas tighter. The door creaked open, revealing a slim figure silhouetted against the dim light of the boiler room. It was Maeve. Her fiery red hair seemed to glow even in the gloom, and her green eyes were wide, surprised to see them there. "Lara," Maeve whispered, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. "What are you doing here?" Elara hesitated, her mind scrambling for an explanation. But then she looked at Thomas, his small, feverish face buried against her shoulder. She couldn't lie. Not to someone who had seen her at her most vulnerable. "Thomas is sick," she admitted, her voice low and urgent. "He has a fever. I brought him here so Matron Grimm's wouldn't send him to the infirmary. He won't survive in there, Maeve. He won't." Maeve's gaze flickered to Thomas, and a shadow of understanding, of shared pain, crossed her face. She remembered the faces of the children in the infirmary, remembered her own terror upon arrival. "He's burning up." Maeve whispered, her voice full of unexpected concern. "We must get him some water, and something to warm him from the inside." Elara looked at her, surprised. She had not expected this, not from the silent, traumatized new arrival. But how? And what about the bell? Matron Grimm's will be doing rounds soon. Maeve's eyes, normally filled with fear, now held a spark of something fierce and determined. "I heard the bell from the infirmary. Sister Agnes is busy with the new delivery of linens. Matron Grimm's will be distracted. I can get water. And I know a trick for warmth. My grandmother taught me. From Ireland." Elara stared at her, a glimmer of hope, faint but persistent, beginning to stir in her chest. Maeve, the silent, lost girl, was offering help. She was offering a lifeline. "What trick?" Elara asked, her voice hushed. "We need herbs," Maeve said, her voice surprisingly confident. "And a way to make them into a tea. Something to break the fever." Her gaze swept around the dusty closet, falling upon a collection of old, forgotten medical texts piled in a corner. And knowledge. Perhaps there is something here. Elara looked at her, truly looked at her. Maeve wasn't just a lost child. She had a spark, a hidden resilience. "What do you need?" Elara asked, a desperate resolve hardening her own voice. "I need to get out of here quickly," Maeve replied, already turning towards the door. "And I need your help to distract Sister Agatha if she comes looking for me. Meet me back here after morning prayers. And bring Thomas. He cannot stay in the dormitory like this." With a swift, silent movement, Maeve slipped out of the closet and disappeared into the gloom of the basement. Elara watched her go, a strange mix of apprehension and hope churning within her. She was placing Thomas's life and their very existence at Maddox into the hands of a near stranger, a girl who had herself been broken by the world. But what other choice did she have? The stone embrace of the orphanage was closing in, and Elara, for the first time, felt a desperate need to fight back, not just for herself, but for the fragile life clutched in her arms. The morning bell, loud and merciless, shattered the silence, a stark reminder that their time was running out. Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the coming days would define whether Thomas would survive Maddox, or join the countless other forgotten children buried in its cold, unmarked ground. The fight for his life had just begun, and it would be fought in the shadows of the silent, unforgiving orphanage. The clamor of the morning bell ripped through the basement, a discordant symphony that seemed to mock Elara's desperate hope. Maeve had vanished as silently as a ghost, leaving Elara clutching Thomas. The weight of her brother's feverish body, a tangible manifestation of her terror. Thomas's breathing was shallow, punctuated by wet, rattling coughs that seemed to tear at his small chest. His skin was burning beneath Elara's touch, and in the dim light, his face appeared unnaturally pale, almost translucent. The enormity of her decision, of hiding him, of defying Matron Grimm's, pressed down on her with suffocating force. If they were caught, the consequences would be dire, not just for her, but potentially for Thomas, sealing his fate more swiftly than the fever itself. Her immediate concern was getting Thomas back to the dormitory before the other children woke fully and the morning rituals began. She couldn't risk leaving him in the closet. His absence would be noted during roll call. Gritting her teeth, Elara carefully unwrapped the musty blankets from around Thomas. He whimpered softly, his eyes fluttering open, unfocused and glazed with sickness. "Time to go, lamb," she whispered, her voice a forced calm. "Just a little walk. Then you can rest again." He was too weak to stand on his own. Elara, though slight, found a surge of adrenaline. She hooked one of his arms over her shoulder, looping her arm around his waist, and began to half carry, half drag him towards the winding stone staircase. Every step was an agony, a Herculean effort that strained her small muscles. Thomas's limp weight felt impossibly heavy, his head lolling against her shoulder. She prayed silently and fervently that no one would be awake, that no one would witness their illicit journey. They ascended the stairs slowly, each creak of the ancient stone amplifying the fear in Elara's chest. The air grew perceptibly colder as they left the damp basement. The main corridor above was still cloaked in shadows, a long, dark tunnel. She could hear the first stirrings from the dormitories, a cough, a muffled sigh, the rustle of straw. Time was slipping away. Finally, they reached their dormitory. The door was ajar, a sliver of gray light already filtering in. Elara pushed it open further, her heart pounding. The room was mostly still, but a few boys were already up, shivering into their coarse clothes. She saw the familiar outline of Matron Grimm's broad back at the far end, overseeing the younger boys dressing. A wave of icy panic washed over Elara. Too late. She couldn't simply walk in with Thomas like this. He was visibly ill, his fever obvious even from a distance. Matron Grimm's would spot him immediately. "Elara." A voice whispered from behind her. It was Maeve. Her fiery hair a faint halo in the dim light. She stood just outside the dormitory door, her hands clutched around a small, lumpy cloth bundle. Her green eyes were wide, urgent. "I saw Matron. She's already started her rounds. You can't go in there with him." Elara's breath hitched. "I know," she whispered, despair creeping into her voice. "But where else? He can't stay here." Maeve glanced quickly down the corridor. "The infirmary. Sister Agnon's is busy. Most of the children are still in the dormitories. We can hide him there for now, just until after prayers." Elara stared at her, incredulous. The infirmary, the very place she had sought to avoid. But Maeve's logic was sound. It was the last place Matron Grimm's would expect to find a child hiding from her. It was a calculated risk. Led the way. Elara breathed, her voice tight with suppressed fear. Maeve nodded, her small face resolute. She moved with surprising speed and silence, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floorboards. Elara followed, dragging Thomas, her strength waning with every labored step. They navigated the winding corridors, passing the silent chapel, until they reached the infirmary door. It was slightly ajar. Maeve pushed it open further. The room was empty, save for the 3 still, sleeping patients in their beds. A faint, cloying smell of sickness hung in the air. Sister Agnes was clearly not there. Maeve pointed to the empty 4th bed, the one Maeve herself had occupied yesterday. "Put him here," Maeve whispered. "No one will notice for a while. It's warm from the other patients." Elara gently lowered Thomas onto the straw mattress. He groaned, stirring slightly, but his eyes remained closed. He was burning up, his small body radiating heat. Elara pulled the thin blanket up to his chin, smoothing his damp hair from his forehead. She noticed a small, dried bruise above his temple from their journey up the stairs, and a pang of guilt struck her. "Thank you, Maeve," Elara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Maeve merely nodded, her green eyes serious. "Now, quickly. We must get to the chapel. Matron Grimm's will know if we are late." They slipped out of the infirmary and hurried towards the chapel, joining the stream of shuffling, half-awake children. They were just in time. The heavy chapel doors creaked open, and Reverend Blackwood, a gaunt figure in his dark cassock, appeared, his eyes scanning the throng. Elara and Maeve melted into the crowd, becoming 2 more anonymous figures among the sea of gray-clad children. The morning prayer session was interminable, a torturous stretch of time where Elara's mind raced, filled with frantic worry for Thomas. Reverend Blackwood's droning voice, usually a numbing drone, felt like a deliberate torment, delaying her return to her brother. She cast a surreptitious glance at Maeve, who stood beside her, surprisingly still, her eyes fixed on the distant altar. There was a quiet intensity about her, a resilience that Elara hadn't expected. As soon as Reverend Blackwood finally intoned the Amen, a rush of cold air swept through the chapel as children scrambled out, eager for the meager breakfast. Elara exchanged a quick, meaningful glance with Maeve. They both knew what they had to do. They moved quickly through the throng, their synchronicity born of desperate necessity. Instead of heading to the dining hall, they veered off towards the infirmary. The corridor was blessedly empty. They slipped inside. Thomas was still there, his breathing still shallow, but he was stirring. His eyes, though still unfocused, were open. Elara rushed to his side, her heart clenching with relief that he was still conscious. "How is he?" Maeve asked, her voice hushed. "He's hot," Elara said, pressing her hand to Thomas's forehead. So hot. Maeve unwrapped the cloth bundle she had carried from the basement. Inside, carefully wrapped, were a handful of dried herbs. They had a faint, earthy aroma. "I found them in the larder, near the old spice rack," she whispered. "Some are for flavor, but some, my grandmother used them for fever." She produced a small, tarnished silver thimble. "And this." It was in the bottom of an old box of sewing supplies. "We can use it to measure." Elara looked at the herbs, a mix of what looked like dried mint, something vaguely resembling chamomile, and a few other nondescript leaves. "How do we make tea?" she asked, a spark of hope flickering in her chest. "We need hot water," Maeve replied, her green eyes thoughtful, and a way to boil it. She glanced around the infirmary. There was no fireplace, no stove, only a small, rusted iron kettle on a dusty shelf. The kitchen. It will be bustling now. We can sneak in. Their plan was simple, audacious, and fraught with peril. During breakfast, with the kitchen staff distracted, Elara would create a diversion, asking Cook a convoluted question about the day's meal, while Maeve, small and quick, would slip in and fill the kettle with hot water from the large simmering pot over the stove. They would also need a small amount of the gruel, something to try and get Thomas to eat, and perhaps some of the stale bread they were given. The execution was a nerve-wracking dance. Elara approached Cook, who was shouting orders at a scullery maid, and launched into a series of questions about the provenance of the potatoes for the noon stew. Cook, bewildered by the unexpected inquisition, paused, giving Maeve the precious seconds she needed. Maeve, light-footed and barely visible amongst the bustling activity, darted to the immense stove, filled the kettle, grabbed a handful of stale bread, and a small, half-empty tin of jam that had been left carelessly on a counter, a rare, illicit luxury. She was back out the door before Cook had even finished her exasperated reply to Elara. Back in the infirmary, Maeve set the kettle on the floor. "Now," she said, her voice a mix of triumph and urgency. "How to heat it." Elara's gaze fell on the single sputtering oil lamp on a small table. "What can balance it here?" she suggested, indicating the kettle. "Carefully. It will take time." It did take time. An agonizingly long time. They took turns holding the kettle precariously over the lamp's flame, their faces grim, their concentration absolute. The air in the infirmary grew warm and humid, and a faint, sweet smell of the heating herbs began to diffuse into the air. Thomas coughed, his small body racked with shivers, but he remained conscious. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the water in the kettle began to bubble weakly. Maeve carefully poured the steaming liquid into a chipped ceramic mug, adding a pinch of each herb. The mixture turned a pale, cloudy green. "This is it," she said, holding the mug out. "Let it steep for a moment." While the tea steeped, Elara crumbled some of the stale bread into the jam and tried to coax Thomas to eat. He swallowed a few small bites, his face contorted in a grimace. It was not much, but it was something. Then Maeve offered the mug of herbal tea. "Drink this, Thomas," she urged gently. "It will make you feel better." Thomas looked at the strange concoction, his eyes wide. Elara took the mug. "It's good lamb. Trust me." She held it to his lips, and he took a tentative sip. He coughed, but then, slowly, he began to drink, encouraged by Elara's soft murmurs and Maeve's watchful gaze. He finished half the mug before turning his head away, exhausted. They settled him back down, pulling the blankets tight around him. "Now we wait," Elara whispered, the words echoing the fragile hope in her heart. The rest of the morning was a tightrope walk of deception and vigilance. Elara and Maeve took turns sneaking back to the infirmary during their designated chores. Elara, assigned to laundry, found myriad excuses to fetch water or supplies, while Maeve, officially in the infirmary, was able to maintain a more constant watch over Thomas, her presence there unquestioned by Sister Agnes, who was perpetually overwhelmed. By midday, there was a subtle change. Thomas's skin was still warm, but the fever seemed to have lessened its grip. He was less restless, his breathing slightly less labored. He slept a deeper, more peaceful sleep than he had managed in days. Elara felt a surge of relief, so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. "He's going to be all right." Elara whispered to Maeve, who was sitting quietly by Thomas's bedside, her gaze fixed on his small, sleeping form. Maeve nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "The herbs work. My grandmother always said they did." That afternoon, a new arrival was brought to the infirmary, a small, gaunt boy with eyes that already held the vacant stare of the defeated. Sister Agnes was distressed, unable to find an empty bed. Her gaze fell on the bed Thomas occupied. Elara's heart seized. She said quickly, stepping forward, "This bed, it's a bit cold. I think the other one, the one by the window, might be better for the new patient. It gets more sun." It was a desperate lie. The window was boarded up. Sister Agnes, flustered and distracted, merely nodded. Yes, perhaps you are right, child. The poor mite needs all the warmth he can get." As Sister Agnes turned to direct the new patient to a different bed, Maeve quickly, silently, covered Thomas's face with a blanket. He was small enough to be easily missed, to be mistaken for a pile of blankets or a forgotten bundle. A wave of profound gratitude washed over Elara. Maeve had understood her unspoken fear and had acted instantly. Their bond, forged in the crucible of this shared secret, was growing stronger with every desperate action. The next few days were a repetition of this precarious dance. Each morning, Elara would sneak Thomas back to the infirmary, Maeve waiting at the door, her eyes sharp and watchful. They would administer the herbal tea, coax him to eat the scraps of food Elara managed to pilfer, and spend every spare moment tending to him, their silent vigilance a shield against the pervasive neglect of the orphanage. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Thomas began to improve. The fever broke, his skin grew cooler, and his breathing became less strained. The cough, though still present, was less frequent, less harsh. He began to eat more readily, though still little, and his eyes lost their glazed appearance, regaining a faint spark of their former brightness. He was still weak, terribly weak, but he was no longer dying. Their secret, however, was becoming increasingly difficult to keep. Thomas, though improving, was still too weak to return to the general dormitory without attracting attention. His absence from morning roll call would eventually be noticed, even by the perpetually preoccupied Matron Grims. "We can't keep him here forever," Elara whispered to Maeve one evening as they huddled in the dark infirmary, watching Thomas sleep. "Someone will notice. And if they do—" Maeve nodded, her expression grim. "He needs to get stronger, and he needs proper food, not just scraps." She paused, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you remember the old medical books in the closet? In the basement?" Elara frowned. "Yes. Dusty old things. My he used to read a lot," Maeve said, her voice distant, a hint of old pain in her words. "He had books. Big ones. He'd read them to me, even if I didn't understand. He said knowledge was power." She looked at Elara, her green eyes bright with a sudden resolve. "Perhaps there is something in those books. Something that can help him get stronger. Something for us all." The idea, born of desperation, took root in Elara's mind. Knowledge, a forgotten luxury in a place that valued only obedience and labor. The basement closet, their makeshift sanctuary, could also be a source of answers. The next morning, armed with a new purpose, Elara sought out Maeve during their laundry duties. "The books," Elara whispered, as they scrubbed shirt side, by side in the freezing water. How do we get to them? And how do we read them without being caught? Maeve hesitated, her hands raw and red from the cold water. The boiler room is not often checked, and the closet it's hidden. But reading in the dark. We'll need light, Elara murmured, her mind racing. And a way to be undisturbed. Their opportunity came that very night. A sudden, violent storm erupted, lashing rain against the orphanage walls, rattling windows, and sending the wind howling down the chimneys. The matron, preoccupied with securing the building and managing the nervous younger children, was distracted. The older boys were kept busy bringing in firewood and sandbags. In the chaos, their absence from the dormitory would be less noticeable, at least for a short while. Now, Elara whispered to Maeve as the dormitory lights were extinguished and the matron's heavy footsteps retreated. They slipped out, making their way to the infirmary first. Thomas was still weak but awake, his eyes following them as they prepared to move him. "Where are we going, Elara?" he whispered, his voice still thin. "To our secret place, Lamb," Elara murmured, wrapping him in an old, scratchy shawl. For a little while. With Maeve's help, they carefully carried Thomas down to the basement, the storm's furious roar muffling their cautious movements. The boiler room was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of wet stone. They eased Thomas into the closet, settling him among the dusty blankets. "Maeve, you search the books," Elara whispered, handing Maeve a precious, carefully hoarded candle stub and a stolen box of matches. "I'll keep watch at the door. Listen for footsteps." Maeve nodded, her red hair catching the faint, flickering light of the candle. She knelt among the stacks of old tomes, her slender fingers carefully sifting through the brittle pages. Elara sat just inside the closet door, her ears straining, every creak and groan of the old building magnified by the storm. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The candle burned down steadily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Maeve, surprisingly, was quick. She seemed to possess an intuitive grasp for finding what she needed. "Hair," she whispered, her voice a low gasp of excitement. "Medicinal plants!" And here, a section on nutrition. For children. Elara leaned closer, peering over Maeve's shoulder. The book was old, its pages yellowed and brittle, but the diagrams were clear, the text surprisingly legible. They found illustrations of common plants, dandelion, nettle, plantain plants that grew wild, even in the harsh climate surrounding the orphanage. The text described their uses: dandelion for cleansing the blood, nettle for strengthening the body, plantain for healing wounds. There's also a section on what children need to grow strong. Maeve continued, her finger tracing the faded print. Not just gruel. Vegetables, milk, even a little meat, if possible. A pang of despair shot through Elara. These were luxuries utterly unobtainable within the orphanage walls. But then, a thought sparked. Vegetables. The orphanage had a garden, albeit a neglected one, and there were wild berries in the woods beyond, when in season. Perhaps. And look! Maeve's voice was triumphant. "A remedy for coughs!" Thyme, it grows everywhere. And horehound. The candle was a mere stub, flickering precariously. They absorbed as much as they could, committing key details to memory. They then turned to the section on hygiene and basic medical care, poring over pages that detailed the importance of cleanliness, fresh air, and rest. It was rudimentary, but in the context of the orphanage's neglect, it was revelatory. They learned how to make simple poultices, how to clean cuts, how to identify signs of worsening illness. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about survival for all of them. A silent rebellion against the very institution that was supposed to care for them. Just as the candle sputtered and died, casting them into abrupt darkness, Elara heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, outside the boiler room. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Someone's coming?" she hissed, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Maeve instinctively pulled Thomas closer, covering him with blankets. Elara flattened herself against the back wall of the closet, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped. A flashlight, a new invention rarely seen, flashed through the crack in the closet door. It was Matron Grimm's. Elara's breath caught. They were caught. Disaster. The light swept slowly across the boiler room, illuminating the immense, hulking shape of the old furnace, the stacks of firewood. It lingered on the closet door for a terrifying second, then moved on. The matron was checking for leaks, for storm damage. Her footsteps receded, then faded. Elara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They had been spared. For now, they spent the rest of the night in the closet, Maeve whispering details from the books, committing them to memory. Elara felt a surge of hope, a fragile seed planted in the barren soil of their despair. They had a new weapon, knowledge. The next morning, Elara and Maeve continued their double lives. By day, they were obedient orphans, scrubbing laundry, mending clothes, enduring the harsh routines. By night, or whenever opportunity arose, they were silent conspirators, gathering what they could, applying their newfound knowledge. Elara began to pay closer attention during her chores. When she was assigned to help in the garden, she subtly identified the wild nettles and dandelions growing in the neglected corners, remembering the illustrations in the book. She began to furtively collect small handfuls, hiding them in her apron. During meal times, she would scan the sparse offerings, looking for any scrap of a vegetable, anything that might provide the nutrients Thomas needed. Maeve, with her quiet observations, would point out opportunities, subtle cues that Elara might have missed. Their joint efforts extended beyond Thomas. They started to apply their knowledge to other children. A small girl with a persistent cough received a small cup of weak thyme tea, carefully brewed over a pilfered lamp in the infirmary when Sister Agnes was momentarily absent. A boy with a festering cut on his hand had it cleaned with water and a poultice of mashed plantain leaves, discreetly applied under the cover of darkness. They worked in tandem, a silent, covert medical team, their actions often going unnoticed, dismissed as children playing or being helpful. Word of their quiet help spread amongst the younger children, whispered from bed to bed. Not openly, not loudly, but through shared glances, a quiet nod of thanks, a small offering of a pilfered crust of bread in return. Elara and Maeve became quiet legends among the most vulnerable, guardians in the shadows. They did not seek recognition, only to alleviate the suffering they saw. Thomas continued to mend. Within a week, his fever was gone, his cough significantly reduced. He was still very thin and weak, but the spark in his eyes had returned. He could walk on his own, slowly, and even managed to eat a full portion of gruel without complaint. The time had come for him to return to the dormitory. The transition was nerve-wracking. Elara accompanied Thomas back, her heart pounding. Matron Grimm's, surprisingly, seemed not to notice Thomas's absence or his slightly improved state, or if she did, she chose to ignore it, lost in the never-ending administrative tasks of the orphanage. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Their success with Thomas emboldened Elara and Maeve. They realized that their knowledge, their ability to act outside the rigid confines of the orphanage's rules, was a powerful tool. They began to explore the orphanage grounds more thoroughly. The forgotten corners, the disused sheds, the wild patches of land beyond the manicured asblaus, or rather, unkempt garden, they were potential sources of what they needed. One afternoon, during a particularly chaotic laundry session, Matron Grimm's left the main gate to the orphanage, unlatched for a few precious minutes, distracted by a delivery cart. Elara, seeing the opportunity, shared a quick glance with Maeve. It was a fleeting, dangerous chance. The woods, Maeve whispered, her eyes alight. There might be more herbs, and berries, and freedom for a little while. Elara's heart pounded. Leaving the orphanage grounds was a grave infraction, punishable by severe lashings, even solitary confinement. But the thought of fresh air, of wild plants, of a moment's reprieve from the suffocating stone walls, go. Elara said, her voice low and urgent. Be quick. I'll make sure no one notices you're gone. Maeve hesitated for only a second. Then, with a small, determined nod, she slipped out of the laundry room, through the main door, and out the unlatched gate, disappearing into the sparse winter woods beyond. Elara watched her go, a knot of fear and anticipation tightening in her stomach. Maeve, the quiet, traumatized girl, was now showing a remarkable courage, a willingness to take risks. The minutes dragged by. Elara worked feverishly, scrubbing clothes, her eyes darting constantly towards the gate. What if Maeve was caught? What if she got lost? The woods were dense, unfamiliar. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Maeve reappeared, slipping back through the gate as quietly as she had left. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, her eyes sparkling, and in her apron, she clutched a bundle of twigs and leaves, some dark, shriveled berries clinging to them. Look, she whispered, her voice breathless with excitement, as she rejoined Elara at the laundry trough. Rose hips! For scurvy, and more thyme. And this, I think it's wild sorrel. Good for strengthening the blood. Elara looked at the meager haul, a smile, rare and genuine, touching her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a victory, a small rebellion against their captors. It was a symbol of their growing independence, their refusal to simply wither and die within the orphanage walls. Their quiet acts of defiance, their small, secret successes began to foster a subtle but profound shift within Elara. She was no longer just a passive survivor clinging to Thomas. She was an agent of change, however small. Maeve's courage, her quiet determination, had ignited something similar within her. They were a team, two lost girls united by a shared purpose. One bitterly cold afternoon, as they were carrying buckets of water from the outdoor pump, they overheard a hushed conversation between Sister Agatha and Reverend Blackwood. The donations have dwindled, Reverend. Sister Agatha wailed, her voice full of despair. The city folk, they have their own troubles. Another outbreak of influenza, they say. We barely have enough coal for heating, let alone food for a proper supper. Matron Grimm's is beside herself. Reverend Blackwood sighed, his gaunt face etched with worry. Times are hard, sister. Perhaps it is time to consider the advertisements again. For those who can afford it. To take on an apprentice. A servant. Any child that can be useful. Elara and Maeve exchanged a look, a cold dread seizing them. Apprentice. Servant. Euphemisms for child labor, for a life of drudgery and servitude, often far worse than the orphanage itself. Children were often taken on by cruel masters, exploited and abused, with little recourse. It was the orphanage's grim solution to dwindling funds, a way to offload mouths to feed. "They'll sell us," Maeve whispered, her voice barely audible, her green eyes wide with fear. Like cattle. Elara's stomach churned. This was the ultimate threat, the looming shadow that haunted every child's waking thoughts. To be sent away, alone, into an unknown fate, often never to be seen or heard from again. It was the deepest fear, a final, ultimate abandonment. That evening, during the sparse supper, Matron Grims stood before the assembled children, her face severe. "Children," she announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous dining hall. "Times are lean. We are thankful for the Lord's bounty, however modest. But resources are scarce. Therefore, it has been decided that some of you, those of sufficient age and strength, will be offered opportunities for placement. For those who are willing to work hard and serve diligently, a new life awaits." A palpable silence descended upon the dining hall, thick with unspoken fear. The younger children looked confused, but the older ones, those who had seen others disappear before, understood. Their eyes darted nervously. "Sister Agatha will be speaking with potential candidates tomorrow," Matron Grims continued, oblivious to the terror she had just unleashed. "Those who are chosen will be notified." Elara's gaze swept across the room, past Thomas, who was too young to understand, but whose hand she instinctively reached for beneath the table. She looked at Maeve, her face pale, her red hair appearing dull in the flickering candlelight. A chill, colder than any winter wind, settled in Elara's bones. This was no longer just about Thomas's fever. This was about their very future. Their tenuous, carefully constructed world of secret remedies and whispered hopes was now under threat. They had to be smart. They had to be invisible. They had to survive. The walls of Maddox Orphanage, once merely a prison, now felt like a cage from which they would soon be forcibly removed, cast out into an uncertain and dangerous world. The whispers of remedies would need to become a roar of defiance if they were to have any hope of escape. The matron's words hung in the frigid air of the dining hall, a death knell echoing the fear that had always simmered beneath the surface of the Maddox Orphanage. Placement. It was a word whispered with dread, a silent horror that painted vivid pictures of isolated farms, dark city cellars, and cruel, unfeeling masters. Elara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, a gnawing anxiety that threatened to consume her. Thomas, oblivious in his innocent hunger, continued to spoon gruel into his mouth, his small, frail hand a comforting anchor in her own. Maeve, however, sat frozen beside her, her usually bright green eyes dulled with a terror that mirrored Elara's own. The days that followed were steeped in a pervasive tension. The older children, those deemed sufficient age and strength, moved with a new, guarded silence, their eyes constantly darting towards the matron's office door as if expecting Sister Agatha to emerge at any moment and summon them to their unknown fate. The younger ones, thankfully ignorant of the true implications, merely sensed the shift in the atmosphere, growing quieter, their games less boisterous. Sister Agatha, a woman usually consumed by her nervous deference to Matron Grimm's, now seemed to swell with a newfound importance. Her pale face flushed with the authority of her new task. She would spend hours closeted with the matron, poring over dusty ledgers and stained application forms, their voices a low, indecipherable hum that only heightened the children's anxiety. Then, one by one, children began to disappear. Not all at once, but subtly, a few here, a few there. A quiet boy named Daniel, known for his gentle nature and quick hands, was the first. He was summoned to the matron's office one morning, dressed in his Sunday best, a cruel irony, and was never seen again. Then came Sarah, a quiet girl with a talent for mending, her tear-streaked face a haunting image as she was led away by a stern-faced woman in black. Each departure was a chilling reminder of their own precarious positions. Elara and Maeve watched these disappearances with growing despair. They spoke in hushed whispers late at night, huddled together in the dormitory, the bitter wind rattling the windows. "What will we do?" Maeve whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They'll pick us next. They'll pick you." Elara's mind raced, desperate for a plan. "We can't be picked," she affirmed, her voice resolute despite the tremor in her hands. "We won't be. But how?" They analyzed the children who had already been taken. Daniel and Sarah were both diligent, quiet, and skilled workers. They were exactly what prospective employers sought: compliant, industrious, and unassuming. This realization sparked a dangerous idea in Elara's mind. If these qualities made them desirable, then the opposite. "We must make ourselves undesirable," Elara stated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "We must become useless. Troublesome, but not so much that they punish us beyond measure." Maeve's green eyes widened. "Useless. But Elara, they will beat us. They will lock us away. It is a risk," Elara acknowledged, "but less than the risk of being sold like livestock. We must be subtle. We must be incompetent. In the specific ways they desire us to be competent." Their first target was laundry. It was Elara's most frequent chore, and she was proficient at it. She began to accidentally mix the colors, turning a pristine white sheet to a muddy gray. She forgot to wring out the water properly, leaving linen dripping and heavy. Her hands, usually nimble, became suddenly clumsy, dropping washed items into the dirt, or tearing small holes in mended clothes with an errant needle. She kept a watchful eye on Sister Agatha, who often oversaw the laundry, observing her reactions. Sister Agatha would sigh, her brows furrowed, muttering about Elara's sudden distraction. But she never inflicted the severe punishments Elara had feared. It was a fine line, enough to be annoying, not enough to be seen as outright rebellious. Maeve, with her smaller stature and foreign accent, found her own methods. When assigned to sweeping or scrubbing, she would leave streaks, miss corners, or use too much water, creating puddles. Her speech, usually soft, became more pronounced, her accent thicker, when she knew Sister Agatha was within earshot. She would feign a childish ignorance, asking questions that seemed naive but were subtly designed to highlight her perceived lack of understanding or her foreign ways. One day, she accidentally put salt in the sugar bowl in the kitchen, causing Cook to bellow in frustration. She quickly apologized, her green eyes wide with feigned innocence, earning a sharp cuff on the ear, but no deeper punishment. The risk escalated when a plump, severe-looking woman, dressed in fine but plain clothing, came to inspect the girls, She was seeking a maid for her modest, but respectable, household. Sister Agatha paraded the girls before her, highlighting their supposed virtues. When it came to Elara, the woman asked her to demonstrate her mending skills. Elara's heart pounded. She knew she was good at mending. Her mother had taught her well. But now, she forced her fingers to tremble, her stitches to be uneven, pulling the fabric taut in some places and leaving it puckered in others. The woman frowned, her lips pursed. "She seems clumsy," she remarked, her voice sharp. Sister Agatha quickly ushered Elara away. A small victory, but a terrifying one. For Thomas, their strategy was different. He was too young to be placed, but his continued frailty might lead to him being institutionalized elsewhere or simply abandoned. Elara and Maeve dedicated themselves to making him appear robust and healthy. They continued their clandestine herbal remedies, steeping the last of their stolen thyme for his cough. Elara pilfered extra portions of gruel for him, bribing the younger boys with promises of stories to let Thomas finish their leftovers. Maeve, when Sister Agatha was preoccupied, would take Thomas outside for brief moments, letting him stand in the weak winter sun, believing in the power of fresh air and sunlight. They taught him to stand tall, to feign strength, to cough discreetly if he absolutely had to. He, sensing the gravity of their actions, complied with a quiet determination beyond his years. Their secret medical operations continued too, but with renewed caution. They became even more discreet, administering their remedies only in the dead of night, or in the most hidden corners of the infirmary. The gratitude of the other children, however, became an unexpected asset. They formed a silent network. Younger children would report Sister Agatha's movements, warn them of impending inspections, or subtly create diversions for Elara and Maeve to sneak off. A boy named Pip, whose sprained ankle Elara had bandaged with stolen linen and Maeve had treated with a poultice of plantain, became their most diligent lookout, his sharp eyes and quick wits invaluable. One evening, as Elara was helping Sister Agatha prepare the smaller children for bed, the sister let out a frustrated sigh. "I swear, Elara, you have grown utterly useless with the needle these past weeks." And Maeve, "That girl is as flighty as a sparrow. I don't know what to do with either of you. No family will want you, not with this sloppiness." Elara's heart leaped. "It was working!" She merely offered a meek, bowed head. "I'm sorry, sister. I try my best." The lie felt like freedom. The matron, however, was not so easily dissuaded. The dwindling funds were a constant pressure. One particularly bleak morning, as a heavy, wet snow fell, coating the orphanage in a suffocating white blanket, Matron Grimm's announced a new wave of inspections. This time, it would be a direct interview with each child, conducted by the Matron herself. Alongside Reverend Blackwood, the gravity of this direct confrontation hung heavy in the air. "They'll see right through us," Maeve whispered, her voice trembling. "The Matron knows everything." Elara felt a cold knot of fear. The Matron was astute, her eyes missing nothing. Feigning incompetence might not be enough. They needed a new strategy, something bolder. That night, huddled in their usual spot in the dormitory, their conversation was urgent, desperate. "What if we simply aren't here?" Elara suggested, the words a terrified whisper. Maeve stared at her, her eyes wide. "Run away." "But where would we go, Elara? It's winter. We'd freeze." "And what about Thomas?" The thought of leaving Thomas behind was unbearable. "We take him with us," Elara said, her voice firm. Despite the fear gripping her. All of us. We can't leave him here. We can't leave any of them to be placed. Her gaze swept across the sleeping forms of the other children, their pale faces illuminated by the faint moonlight. A sudden, fierce protectiveness surged through her. The idea of escape, once a desperate, unthinkable last resort, now felt like their only option. But it was a terrifying prospect. They were children with no money, no connections, and nowhere to go in the harsh, unforgiving city of Boston in winter. The stories of street children, of workhouses, of the squalid, disease-ridden rookeries were enough to make even the stoutest heart falter. "We need a plan," Maeve said, her voice still trembling, but a spark of her usual determination returning. "We need supplies, food, and a safe place to go, even for a night." Their minds, sharpened by months of survival and secret plotting, began to work. Their target, the orphanage's annual Christmas charitable collection. Every year, around late December, the Matron would receive boxes of donated clothes, blankets, and even a few tins of preserved food from benevolent city churches. It was usually stored in a locked cellar, separate from their meager daily provisions. It was their one opportunity to gather supplies. But it was heavily guarded. The opportunity came on the eve of Christmas. The orphanage, usually a place of grim austerity, was transformed into a temporary, fragile semblance of festivity. A few flickering candles illuminated the chapel, a sparse fir tree stood in the corner, and a handful of donors from the city were invited to observe the children's joyful carols. Matron Grimm's and Reverend Blackwood were preoccupied, playing their parts for the benefactors. Sister Agatha, flustered and overwhelmed, was supervising the serving of a slightly more substantial meal than usual, a rare indulgence. It was chaos, the kind of chaos they could exploit. "Tonight," Elara whispered to Maeve during the carol service, her voice barely audible above the children's wavering voices. "After the visitors leave. When everyone is sleeping. The cellar key is on Matron Grimm's belt. She leaves it on her bedside table at night." Maeve's eyes widened. "The Matron's room. Elara, that's madness. It's our only chance." Elara insisted, her jaw set. "We need those supplies. And we need to get Thomas out. And maybe others too." Their plan began to form, piece by intricate piece. Maeve, small and agile, would be the one to retrieve the key from Matron Grimm's room. Elara, stronger and more familiar with the cellar's layout, would enter and gather supplies. Thomas, along with a few other trusted younger children from their silent network, Pip, and a quiet girl named Lily, whose sister had been placed a week prior, would wait outside, near the boiler room, ready to move. That night, the orphanage was uncharacteristically quiet after the Christmas visitors departed. The children, exhausted by the day's forced cheer, fell into a deep sleep, broken only by the occasional sigh or restless murmur. Elara and Maeve waited until the familiar rhythm of Matron Grimm's heavy snores echoed down the corridor. "Be careful," Elara whispered, as Maeve, a small, dark shadow, slipped out of the dormitory. Maeve moved like a phantom, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The matron's room was at the end of the corridor, an intimidating bastion of authority. The door was, mercifully, slightly ajar. Maeve slipped inside. The room was dark, permeated with the matron's cloying perfume. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear the matron's deep, guttural snores from the large, 4 poster bed. She felt her way, inch by agonizing inch, towards the bedside table, guided by the faint outline of the furniture in the gloom. Her hand brushed against a small, cold object, the key ring. She grasped it, her fingers closing around the cold iron, and gently, carefully lifted it. It clinked softly against the wooden table. Maeve froze, her breath caught in her throat. The snoring paused. Maeve waited, her heart pounding in her ears, her entire body rigid. Then, the snores resumed, deep and rhythmic. Maeve let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She slipped back out of the room, as silently as she had entered. Back in the dormitory, Elara met her, her eyes wide with apprehension. Maeve held up the key ring, a small, triumphant glint in her green eyes. "Now, the cellar," Elara whispered. They woke Thomas and the few others. Pip, a naturally light sleeper, was instantly alert. Lily, though fearful, showed a brave resolve. Elara explained the plan in hurried, hushed tones. Thomas, though still small, understood. He merely nodded, his eyes wide with trust. They crept down to the basement, the large iron key cold and heavy in Elara's hand. The cellar door was massive, its ancient lock groaning as Elara inserted the key. It clicked open with a loud, resounding thud that seemed to echo through the entire building. They froze, listening intently. Nothing. Only the howl of the wind outside. Inside the cellar, it was pitch black, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweet, like forgotten apples. Elara fumbled for a candle, struck a match, and a small, flickering flame illuminated the cavernous space. Boxes were stacked high, filled with clothes, blankets, and a few precious tins of preserved fruit and dried meat. Quickly, Elara urged, her voice low. They began to fill their stolen burlap sacks with anything they could carry, thick woolen blankets, scratchy but warm, a few pairs of sturdy shoes, tins of fruit, dried jerky, and hardtack biscuits. Elara even found a small, heavy axe, its blade dull, but its weight reassuring. It was a tool, a weapon, a means of survival. Just as they were finishing, a sudden, sharp creak from the stairs above shattered the silence. Footsteps. Heavy. Approaching. "Someone's coming!" Pip hissed, his eyes wide with terror. Elara's blood ran cold. The Matron. She must have woken. They were trapped. "Hide!" Elara hissed, pushing Thomas and the others behind the largest stack of boxes. Maeve, quick as a cat, extinguished the candle, plunging them into absolute darkness. The cellar door opened. A sliver of light from a lantern pierced the gloom. Then, Reverend Blackwood's voice, low and gruff. "Is everything secure, Matron?" I heard a noise. Matron Grimm's reply, her voice a low rumble, sent shivers down Elara's spine. "Just checking, Reverend." With the storm, one cannot be too careful. I thought I heard something from the cellar. But Elara could hear the rustle of their clothes, the clank of the Matron's key ring. They were in the cellar. They were searching. "It seems all is in order," Reverend Blackwood said, his voice tinged with impatience. "Just the wind, perhaps." But Matron Grimm's was not so easily convinced. Her lantern beam swept across the cellar, inch by terrifying inch, illuminating the stacks of boxes, the dusty floor. It came closer, closer to their hiding spot. Elara pressed Thomas's trembling body against her own, her hand clamped over his mouth to muffle any sound. Maeve, beside her, was a statue, her breath held. The light paused. It seemed to hover over their hiding place for an eternity. Elara could feel the Matron's gaze, piercing the darkness. Then, a sudden, muffled cough from Lily, who was huddled deeper behind the boxes. The light immediately snapped towards the sound. What was that? Matron Grimm's voice was sharp, a predator closing in. Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was it. They were discovered. But then, Maeve acted. With a swiftness that was almost preternatural, she stepped out from behind the boxes, directly into the light of the lantern, holding one of the stolen blankets. Her face was pale, but her green eyes, usually so fearful, now held a defiant glint. "Matron!" Maeve cried, her voice surprisingly strong, though trembling slightly. I heard a noise! I thought I heard a rat, and it was so cold. I just wanted to get a blanket from the cellar. For the others. They are shivering so. Matron Grimm's face, illuminated by the lantern, was a mask of fury. "Maeve O'Connell! You insolent wretch!" Stealing from the charity stores. And in the middle of the night, Reverend Blackwood stepped forward. "A rat, child. In the cellar. You should have told Sister Agatha. This is highly irregular." I was scared," Maeve stammered, playing her part, her eyes wide and seemingly innocent. "And my teeth were chattering." "The orphanage is so cold, Reverend. We are all so cold." Her words, though a lie, held a kernel of truth that resonated even with Reverend Blackwood, who felt the chill of the unheated orphanage. Matron Grimm's, however, was not swayed by such sentiment. Scared. "You will be more than scared, girl! You will be punished severely for this transgression?" As Matron Grimm's advanced, ready to seize Maeve. Elara knew this was their chance. Maeve was buying them time. "Run," Elara whispered, pushing Thomas and the others forward towards the cellar door, which was still open. Now, Thomas, Pip, and Lily, their small faces etched with terror, scrambled out of the cellar and into the dark basement corridor. Elara quickly followed, dragging her heavy sack of supplies, her eyes fixed on Maeve. "Maeve!" "Come on," Elara hissed. Maeve glanced back, her eyes meeting Elara's. She knew. She had bought them precious seconds, but she couldn't follow. Not yet. She had to take the full brunt of their discovery. "Go." "Elara!" Maeve cried, her voice suddenly loud, filled with a raw, desperate courage. "Save Thomas!" "Go?" Matron Grimm seized Maeve by the arm, her grip like iron. "You will regret this, child." Elara hesitated, a wrenching decision tearing at her heart. Leave Maeve. The girl who had saved Thomas, who had become her closest ally, her friend. But Thomas's pale face, Pip's terrified eyes, Lily's desperate whisper of "my sister," they propelled her forward. This escape was for all of them. Maeve knew it. She had made the ultimate sacrifice. With a final, anguished glance at Maeve. Struggling in Matron Grimm's grasp, Elara turned and fled, pulling the cellar door shut behind her with a heavy thud, hoping the sound of the locking mechanism would provide a momentary diversion. The clang of the key in the lock, followed by the matron's enraged shout, echoed through the basement. Elara burst into the boiler room, where Thomas and the others waited, trembling. "We have to go." Now, she led them through the labyrinthine corridors of the orphanage, her mind racing, adrenaline coursing through her veins. They navigated familiar paths, the laundry room, the kitchen, the dining hall, now silent and eerie in the dead of night. They reached the rarely used side exit, a heavy, bolted wooden door that led to the back of the orphanage grounds, away from the main gate. The bolts were stiff, rusted. Elara pushed and pulled with all her might, her muscles screaming in protest. Thomas and Pip, small as they were, pushed against the door, their combined weight adding to the effort. Finally, with a loud groan of protest, the bolts slid open. The cold night air hit them, a stinging slap to the face. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in an alien white. The wind howled, whipping flakes into their faces. It was a hostile, unforgiving landscape. "This way," Elara gasped, pulling the heavy door open, revealing a world of white and shadow. They stumbled out, 4 small figures against the vast, indifferent expanse of the night. The orphanage, its dark bulk rising behind them, loomed like a monstrous predator. Its walls, once a prison, now seemed like a tomb they had just escaped. They ran, blindly at first, into the swirling snow, their feet sinking into drifts, the cold biting at their exposed skin. Thomas coughed, a weak, rasping sound that tore at Elara's heart. But he didn't complain. He just held her hand tighter. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs ached, until the oppressive silhouette of the Maddox Orphanage had faded into the snowy distance, replaced by the indistinct shapes of distant trees, and the faint, diffused glow of the city lights. They found refuge in a disused, dilapidated shed on the edge of a frozen field, its walls crumbling, its roof leaky, but offering a temporary shield from the biting wind. Elara quickly unpacked the blankets, wrapping Thomas and the younger children tightly. She distributed the hardtack and jerky, forcing them to eat. They huddled together, a small, shivering band of fugitives, united by their shared escape and their uncertain future. The wind howled through the gaps in the shed walls, a mournful lament that echoed the turmoil in Elara's heart. She looked at the children, Thomas, Pip, Lily, their faces pale in the dim light of the single flickering match she had risked lighting. They were safe, for now, but at what cost? Maeve. The memory of her defiant green eyes, her courageous sacrifice, was a raw wound in Elara's soul. She had made a choice, a terrible choice, but she believed it was for the greater good. For Thomas, for the others, for a chance at a different life. The city lay before them, a glittering expanse of distant lights, promising both opportunity and untold dangers. They were free, but utterly alone, adrift in a world that had forgotten them once already. Their journey had just begun. The orphanage was behind them, a dark chapter closed. But the vast, indifferent wilderness of 1849, America lay ahead, and they were but 4 lost children, clutching at hope in each other, facing a new dawn that held both promise and the terrifying unknown. They were no longer America's lost children, merely hidden. Now, they were America's found children, if they could only find a place to belong.